You're watching the fourth in a series of videos critiquing the Legend of Zelda series. Today we are looking at Link's Awakening, originally released in 1993 for the Nintendo Game Boy. This game just experienced a huge resurgence thanks to a modern remake that served to expose the forgotten classic to a new generation of players. Due to the age of the original and the popularity of the remake, I think it is a safe assumption that most people watching this video will be more familiar with the new Nintendo Switch version. Thankfully, it doesn't make a huge difference whether you spent your childhood squinting at the Game Boy original or hadn't even heard of Link's Awakening until the remake last year. In my case, I fall somewhere in the middle. I first experienced the game in its 1998 colorized deluxe version on the 3DS's Virtual Console service almost 10 years ago. The core experience is consistent between all versions, but I will specifically be analyzing the original release. I made this decision because I want this retrospective series to be an accurate look back at the growth of the franchise, and therefore I wanted to make it a priority to play the games in their original form. I would never argue that the 2019 remake doesn't offer stunning art direction and excellent quality of life improvements that fix many of the shortcomings of the original. If you are picking one up to play right now and aren't strangely obsessed with authenticity like yours truly, the remake is the way to go. You'll have a great time. That being said, I've played all three versions, and I can promise you that they all share the same core. If you've only played Link's Awakening 2019, you can still enjoy this critique, and you even get the bonus satisfaction of smugly chuckling to yourself every time I complain about an annoyance that you never had to face. And with all of that out of the way, I don't want to waste any more time discussing the different iterations of Link's Awakening. Let's just focus on the original Game Boy incarnation now. The game originated as an experiment to see if it was possible to port A Link to the Past to Nintendo's new monochromatic handheld. Eventually, the side project morphed into an original title developed over a 1.5-year time frame. This is just my conjecture, but I don't think the development team would have thought of this as the true follow-up to the groundbreaking Link to the Past. Obviously, it was the fourth game to bear the Legend of Zelda name, but as a small Game Boy title, I don't think it was being set up as Zelda 4, the big sequel that would push the series to new heights. This attitude in its creation is what makes Link's Awakening special. Because there was less riding on it, the smaller title is allowed to challenge series traditions and veer into more experimental territory. Link's Awakening questioned if a Zelda game could be about more than just rescuing Hyrule from Ganon for the nth time. What if neither Hyrule or Ganon even appear? Or, even crazier, could a Zelda game remain a Zelda game without the titular princess? That's far from the end of the wackiness in Link's Awakening. You'll find more fourth wall breaks than I could list. The characters of Koholint Island seem acutely aware that they aren't real. Although it's generally played for laughs, this meta writing actually can get a little unnerving at times. You'll run into so many Goombas, Shy Guys, and Chain Chomps that you would think you were playing a Super Mario spin-off. And then the game pushes the effect even further by including regular platformer side-scrolling sections. Link's Awakening still stands out from the pack with how zany it is willing to get. I can't even imagine how fresh it felt for those who played it at release. While the game's handheld nature certainly offered more creative liberty to the team, it wasn't all sunshine and roses. Link's Awakening is held back by its hardware more than any other game in the series. It's awfully difficult to capture the vibrancy of its design on a monochromatic, postage stamp-sized screen that lacked any backlighting. Even blown up on whatever modern display you are using today, the game's visuals struggle to immerse you in its world. Hardware limitations necessitated the return of a segmented map, broken into areas that fit on a single screen. The smooth scrolling traversal of Link to the Past was instrumental in making the map feel cohesive, and it hurts to lose that advancement. I almost feel bad for pointing out these shortcomings, because when you step back, it's truly a miracle of game design that the full Zelda experience was able to be packed onto such a tiny machine. Link's Awakening is the first iterative Zelda sequel, a game content to use its predecessor as a base rather than starting from scratch. That doesn't sound like a praiseworthy accomplishment at first glance, but the context of its hardware reveals just how incredible a feat it truly was. Outside of technical downgrades, this is as much a Zelda game as any other. Almost nothing was lost in the translation to a handheld. The adventure is as grand as it's ever been. That adventure begins with Link washing up on the beach of Koholint Island and being resuscitated by Marin. This first interaction is the game's proclamation that it isn't your typical Zelda game. No Zelda, no Hyrule. Marin's father, a strangely familiar-looking mustached man named Tarin, hands over your shield, but the sword won't come that easily. Playing these games back to back has brought my attention to the different ways the sword is obtained. The original game relied entirely on the player's natural curiosity. It trusted the player would find the sword themselves, but didn't force them to. Zelda 2's emphasis doesn't lie in exploration, so Link carries a sword from the start. Link to the Past dramaticized Link obtaining the sword in a story moment, but fell back on shameless level design tricks to force the player along the set path to find it. While not as elegant as the original's hands-off approach, I really like the way Link's Awakening handles the task. Marin encourages you to head south, to the beach, where you will eventually find your sword, but the game allows you to organically forge your own path. A carefully placed bush prevents progress to the north, and some boulders restrict you to the westernmost portion of the island, but there is still quite a large amount of explorable space available right away. I count a total of 37 screens that can be reached before the sword is required to open up more of the map. I briefly discussed the concept of item gates in a previous video, but I really want to expand on the idea as Link's Awakening uses them expertly to slowly open up the island. If the teal is the area Link can explore right off the bat, the red represents the screens that are opened with the sword, now that that pesky bush blocking entry to the mysterious forest can be bypassed. After the completion of the first dungeon, where the ability to jump over small gaps with Rock's Feather is unlocked, the yellow screens open up. This is still a relatively constrained section of the map to prevent new players from getting overwhelmed, but it really opens up after the second dungeon. The Power Bracelet enables Link to clear those boulders I mentioned earlier out of the way, and allows access to a huge chunk of the central part of the island all at once. Once the Pegasus boots are found in the third dungeon, the vast majority of the island is open to the player. Based on my little coloring job, it might look like the item gates taper off after this point, but they actually persist throughout the entire game. Just because a screen is colored in doesn't mean that everything on that square is accessible with the items available. Each item you get opens up new discoveries until the very end of the game. This gradual unlocking of the map is very different from both Zelda 1 and Link to the Past, but it works for Link's Awakening. Strict restrictions on exploration sounds like a terrible thing, but its implementation encourages players to focus on one segment at a time, which benefits the shorter pick-up-and-play sessions of the handheld system. The gradual unveiling of the map offers continuous opportunities for rewarding exploration throughout the entire game, rather than front-loading it all in a more open map. Restricted exploration doesn't sound desirable at first blush, especially for a Zelda game, but it isn't without benefits if the right balance is struck. That being said, the blatant hand-holding where you are told where to go at the end of every dungeon, not once, but twice, is inexcusable. Link's Awakening's Koholint Island is approximately the same size as Link to the Past's map of Hyrule, and features many recycled elements that elicit a funny sense of deja vu. I mean, look at this particular screen connecting Mabe Village to the mysterious forest. Might it remind you of the one connecting Kakariko to the Lost Woods? And I bet you'll never guess how to initially enter the castle in the center of the map. Despite all of these superficial similarities, the two actually end up feeling very different to traverse. The side effects of the initially restrictive layout are felt even after all of the item gates are unlocked. Link's Awakening's map is far more labyrinthian and challenging to traverse. To get from point A to B in A Link to the Past, you can generally just wander in the right direction and you'll be fine. Link's Awakening takes more effort to navigate because each region is generally only connected by a small number of choke points that limit your options. As long as the player pays attention to the layout and has a little bit of spatial awareness, this is never a problem, but it gives traversal a completely different feel. Some players might consider this new style an improvement, and others might prefer the old freeform layouts. What can't be argued is that this new design is another case where Link's Awakening is held back by its hardware. The game allows 2 items to be equipped at once, mapped to the A and B buttons. Your sword is likely going to be a permanent fixture of your loadout, which leaves only one spot for all of your other items to swap between. These choke points that litter the map almost universally feature an item gate, and 9 times out of 10, the required item won't be the one you currently have equipped. When crossing the map, it can feel like you are spending more time managing your inventory than actually in-game. The previous games also restricted Link to only one item at a time, but this limitation has only now reared its ugly head due to the way Link's Awakening's map is designed. Thankfully, it was never as bad as in Link's Awakening again. This particular annoyance is one that was always destined to solve itself as future hardware added more and more active buttons, but at the time it turned traversal into a chore. The segmented nature of Link's Awakening extends beyond its map design. Compared to its predecessors, the game is rigidly directed in its progression. Again, at first this sounds like it can only be a step backwards, but after more consideration, I believe it is to the game's favor overall. The game has essentially given up even the illusion of non-linearity. The order in which dungeons are challenged is completely fixed. I don't have to explain why this particular point is disappointing. But on the other hand, by requiring dungeons to be tackled in order, the game is able to give players more to do between those dungeons, and, crucially, can make those tasks more interesting as well. Especially in the latter half of Link to the Past, it can feel like you are just doing one dungeon after another, with nothing in between. No matter how great the dungeons are, you need some content between them, and this is where Link's Awakening shines. For instance, immediately following your victory over the first dungeon, you are tasked with a rescue mission for Bow Wow the dog. Between the second and third dungeon, you must find and retrieve 5 golden leaves that Richard lost in Canalit Castle. Before gaining access to the fourth dungeon, you must bring Marin across the map to Animal Village to wake up a sleeping walrus, that is blocking your path. Later on, you'll use your ocarina to bring the legendary rooster back from the grave, and use it to fly up the mountain range. All these segments work wonders on the pacing of the game, and further justify the directed and segmented approach it takes. They are especially important because Link's Awakening lacks a big turning point like the introduction of the Dark World, so just doing dungeon after dungeon could quickly grow monotonous without these little spurts of variety. Another benefit of the more fleshed out interstitials is a greater connection formed between the player and the islanders. These characters are simply charming, and by forcing you to interact with them more, the story hits even harder. More on that later. A trading sequence, the first of many in the Zelda series, really puts the characters front and center. You'll start out with a Yoshi doll, and by interacting with the various characters, find out who would most appreciate it. Once you gift the doll, you'll receive another item to offload, and the cycle keeps repeating. In most Zelda games, trading sequences are completely optional, but in Link's Awakening, you are required to progress most of the way down the chain. The game forces you to connect to its characters, and does so in a fun and clever way. The dungeons of A Link to the Past were the highlight of that game for me, and those of Link's Awakening effortlessly maintain that high standard. The dungeons of this game remain a great combination of combat and puzzle solving, but the scale has been tipped a bit more towards the puzzle side, I would say. For one, the dungeon layouts have grown even more complex and maze-like. Especially in the later dungeons, the game frequently punishes thoughtless wandering with one-way doors and obstacles that force you to be purposeful with your actions. Dungeons like these can't be solved by accident, and run the risk of frustrating the player, but I can't think of any instance where the game is outright unfair with its puzzles. Ideally, if you get stuck in a dungeon, you'll be able to figure it out after a break when you return with a fresh mind. If you do end up having to consult some outside help, you should feel like it was your fault for not being clever enough, never the game's fault for being too obscure. Link's Awakening holds to that standard in its puzzles all the way through. The aesthetic design of the dungeons unfortunately have declined in the transition to a handheld. This should come as no surprise, especially as this was an area Link to the Past struggled with even on the vastly more capable Super Nintendo. The blocky designs to every room and lack of color really limit the potential for each dungeon to have its own unique feel. To the game's credit, each dungeon does have its own background music loop, but the blips and bloops still fail to push a dungeon identity. In the absence of unique aesthetic personalities for the dungeons, all of the weight falls on the mechanical dungeon design. Link's Awakening makes one massive breakthrough in this area that we take for granted these days. For the first time in the series, the dungeons are built around their key item. There were small tastes of this philosophy in Link to the Past, but those were exceptions, never the rule. Link's Awakening commits to this method of dungeon design in nearly every single one of its levels. I guess I should better explain what I'm talking about and why it's such a positive change. Whenever you enter a dungeon, you are generally restricted in your initial explorations. In Link to the Past, this was usually done with locked doors and small keys, gradually opening up access to more and more rooms. Link's Awakening still makes use of small keys, but often something other than locked doors is impeding your progress. For example, in the first dungeon, scattered holes in the floor restrict your progress. Whatever this obstacle is, you'll be blocked by it again and again throughout the dungeon until you eventually find the key item, in this case, Rock's Feather. Suddenly, you have the tools to open these locks, and the entire dungeon is available to you. At least for me, this is the part that I most anticipate in every dungeon. It's such a blast to return to all blocked off areas and see what lies in wait. It's just an immensely satisfying progression loop. The strategy of building a dungeon around its item makes up for the bland aesthetics and gives each dungeon a unique flavor. Bottle Grotto is the one with all the heavy jars that you can eventually pick up. Angler's Cavern is the one where you learn to swim with the flippers. The hookshot is indispensable in Catfish's Maw. This might not sound all that exciting to someone used to the modern Zelda games, but the dungeons just weren't designed this way in Link to the Past. It's been carried through the rest of the series as an integral part of the Zelda formula, but it began on this little handheld game. I'll admit that the focus on a dungeon item did eventually grow stale, but that was many, many games later and does nothing to diminish the breakthrough Link's Awakening made. It's kind of ironic that as much as I've praised the item-focused dungeons, my favorite in the game is the only one that breaks from this mold. That dungeon is Eagle's Tower, and it's by far the most unique dungeon in the series thus far. You receive the Mirror Shield in the dungeon, but it never really plays a role in the challenges you find within. For one, this is the only dungeon in Link's Awakening that features multiple floors. The Tower of Hera, from Link to the Past, challenged the player's spatial reasoning with puzzles involving dropping from one floor to the one below, and Eagle's Tower pushes the idea even further. But that's not even the focus of the dungeon. The focus lies with this ball on the second floor. Link can carry it around and throw it, but while holding the ball, his actions are limited. The tower is supported by 4 pillars on this floor, which can be destroyed with the ball. Getting the ball to the pillars is far easier said than done. This requires intimate map knowledge and a lot of clever thinking. Once you know where the pillars are, you need to come up with a plan for how to move the ball to the pillar, and an entirely separate plan for how to move Link himself there. The two have the same destination, but can never simply take the same trip. It's really ingenious puzzle design, and makes you feel like a complete champ when you finally take out all 4 pillars. At that point, the 4th floor falls down upon the 3rd floor, like a puzzle piece slotting into place, and the whole dungeon layout is changed. It's really cool stuff, honestly, and there hasn't been anything like it in any other Zelda game. Each dungeon concludes with a boss fight against one of the game's nightmares. These fights don't really hold up to those in Link to the Past, because at least some of the appeal comes from the spectacle of the bosses, and the Game Boy's power severely limits their design. The nightmare fights are serviceable, and consistently feature the dungeon's item, but are ultimately unremarkable. The prize within each dungeon is one of 8 musical MacGuffins, and that brings me to the game's story. To make things clear up front, I'm not trying to make the claim that this is one of the greatest narratives in gaming or anything as hyperbolic as that. When I praise the depth of Link's Awakening story, I do so in the context of the series thus far, and what one might expect from a Game Boy game. An air of mystery is maintained for most of the runtime, but the game offers many, many hints that Koholint isn't as it appears. Most players will figure out the island's secret long before it's spelled out, that being that the entire game takes place within the Windfish's dream. It's in the title after all. Link's quest is to wake the Windfish from its slumber so he can return to the real world. This dream is implemented so well in the game. It's easy to forget it when you are focused on the classic Zelda gameplay, but it permeates the game's DNA if you are paying attention. Dream logic completely explains all the eyebrow-raising crossover content. You can never predict who will pop up in your dreams. What's so crazy about SimCity's Dr. Wright or Super Mario USA's villain Wart appearing in the fantasy? Remember I mentioned the numerous instances of déjà vu, where exact map layouts are recycled from Link to the Past? Maybe I'm reaching, it is possible that these were just reused as a shortcut, but stuff like this feels intentional, doesn't it? When Link is sucked into the dream world, some of his own personal demons even hitch the ride. The final nightmare you face takes the form of both Aghanim and Ganon, back for a rematch after their defeat in A Link to the Past. This isn't a case of Nintendo just slapping a cheap, "it was all a dream" twist at the end. It's well thought out and entirely earned. What makes the twist so effective is the bittersweetness that comes with it. Link must wake the Windfish, but in doing so, all of Koholint will cease to exist outside his memories. This game makes a concerted effort to push its characters to the forefront. Players will inevitably form a personal bond with Marin in particular. Link and Marin's relationship begins with her nursing him back to health after he washes ashore, and goes full circle when Link saves her in the mountains. In between those two bookends, their bond grows stronger with each interaction, punctuated by an extremely tender moment on the beach that pulls on the heartstrings. The Ballad of the Windfish, a beautiful song, repeated countless times throughout the game, is taught to you by Marin, and every time you hear it you can't help but be reminded of the fate awaiting her. This little game does everything in its power to make you fall in love with Marin and the other denizens of the dream, then, in leading you to awaken the Windfish, essentially kills them all by your hand. In comparison to the simple good versus evil of the previous Zelda games, Link's Awakening is simply profound and a high watermark for the series as a whole. There's a lot I skimmed over with this game, but that's because so much of it is pulled from A Link to the Past. Dedicating time to the combat system or the methods in which heart pieces and other secrets are hidden would be redundant. I don't want to waste any more of your time, so I'll just be leaving you with my closing thoughts now. The focus in Link's Awakening is what really stood out to me most when playing. The story is nice and contained, the pacing never drags, and there isn't any fat to speak of in the inventory or dungeons. It's all just really lean. Link's Awakening might not shake up the formula much, but it has successfully polished the traditional Zelda experience to a brilliant sheen. This game ran the risk of being remembered as just another Zelda game, but creative decisions allowed it to stand on its own 2 feet as an extremely solid entry in the still nascent series. The game is overflowing with personality and easily makes a case for itself in the franchise's history books. If you choose to experience the original versions, you'll obviously have to make compromises on the technical side, but the game's core design marks a new high point for the series. I hope you'll agree that, at the end of the day, that's what ultimately counts.